Hey everyone, we're happy you could join us for today's session, The Shifting Landscape of Mobile Test Automation with expert speaker Jonathan Lips. Our speaker needs no introduction, but I'll give a short one anyway. Jonathan is the architect and project lead for Appium, the popular open source automation framework. He's also the founding principal of Earl Grey, a consulting firm helping customers successfully leverage the power of Appium. And he is also the author of Appium Pro, the weekly Appium newsletter. Jonathan has worked as a programmer in tech startups for over 15 years and holds master's degrees in philosophy and linguistics from Stanford and Oxford, respectively. So, Jonathan, I think that we have mostly everyone here. I think you can kick off the session.
All right, thank you, Adi. I'm very excited to be here, and hopefully everyone can hear me, and we'll have a good session here together today. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the shifting landscape of mobile automation. It's a bit of a generic title. What's interesting is that I usually spend my time talking 100% about Appium because that's the project that I'm involved with and that I helped to start and that I really believe in. But it's always good to take a step back now and then and look at the broader landscape. So today I'm going to be talking about kind of the current state of mobile automation vis-a-vis what came before and what I think might be coming in the future. And of course, I think Appium is playing a huge role in mobile automation today and will hopefully continue to play a huge role in mobile automation in the future. But we're not going to be focusing just on Appium today. So I'll give you a good picture, hopefully, of everything that's going on. So here we are, the Applitools webinar on the internet. Today is February 23rd, and let's get started. So, as Adi mentioned, I have recently started a consulting company called Earl Grey, and just trying to help people be successful with Appium. I'm writing this newsletter that a lot of people have found valuable already, and I'll have a link to that at the end. And of course, hopefully you're familiar with Appium, the mobile test automation framework, which is completely open source and community-led. So let's begin by going back 5 years ago. Now, in the big scheme of things, 5 years isn't a long time ago, but in mobile automation years, this is like centuries ago. This is like the age of the dinosaurs. And I mean that almost literally. There are a bunch of very old technologies relative to what's out there today. 5 years ago, early 2013, Appium had just come on the scene in its incarnation as a Node.js automation server. And it came into a world with a lot of other technologies, actually. So mobile automation was new 5 years ago, but there were a lot of people trying to make it work. Everybody knew that mobile automation should be a thing. We should learn from the lessons of web application development, where we pioneered test automation and continuous integration and all this. We should bring all this to mobile. And it was a hard problem to solve, but a lot of projects were out there trying to solve it. It was sort of like the Wild West of mobile automation. So we had projects that were kind of supported by Apple and Google themselves. Google had a couple different technologies, its instrumentation technology, and then something more recent called UI Automator, which was designed to be a sort of friendlier API and language for writing UI functional tests. And Apple had released a tool called Instruments, which was primarily a kind of profiler for running applications, but which had this quirky little feature. I guess it wasn't even really an application. It was just a feature where you could dump some JavaScript into a text box, and it would be run in the context of an instrument session, and you could automate an iOS application that way. And so this was a very kind of early stuff, but you could do a lot with it. And then we had kind of third-party frameworks, if you will, open source for the most part projects that weren't related to Google or Apple, but were trying to solve the problem for the community. So we had iOS driver, we had KIF, Calabash, one of the oldest, most well-known technologies, things like Robotium. You might not have heard of Frank before. And of course, Appium, as I said, had just come on the scene. So this was what it looked like 5 years ago. It's interesting to note how many of these projects were open source. So they're, the only proprietary project was really Apple's technology. Of course, you couldn't see the source code for instruments or its UI automation, JavaScript API. The documentation was poor. It wasn't well supported. The kinds of things that you unfortunately expect from Apple's testing tools team or person, or however many little elves they have working on testing over there at Apple. I put a star by a couple of these, the Google technologies, because of course it's arguable whether Android code is really open source in the way that a lot of these other projects were, in the sense of it not being community-led project, but having code dumps from Google and so on. But in general, these were open source efforts, and open source was really leading the day in mobile automation, leading the charge of new technologies. So that's 5 years ago. Where are we at today? Do we have any of the same players, or is the landscape shifted? And as you can tell from the title of this talk, I think that the landscape has really shifted. Here's the list of the technologies that I think are relevant today after talking with a number of people about what they're using or planning on using or looking at. So this isn't an exhaustive list of every technology that exists, but it's what I think is relevant. And the only technology that is both here and on the slide from 5 years ago is, of course, Appium, which I'm quite happy about. 5 years is a long time for a project to survive, and let's hope for 5 more for Appium. But these other technologies have come on the scene. We have new technologies from Apple and Google. So, Google likes to have a plethora of tools to solve the same general problem. So they came up with Espresso, or probably one team at Google came up with Espresso, and people started using it. And it's now really become the de facto kind of Google tool for automating Android UIs. And iOS, as most of us have probably experienced, came out with its own new technology about a year and a half, 2 years ago, called XUITest. And it completely replaced the instruments UI automation technology, which was used before. So that has been deprecated and since completely removed from iOS simulators and devices. And now if you want to run tests on iOS, you've got to get into the XUITest world. There are also still some third-party frameworks that think that they can do it better than the ones provided by Google and Apple, or just have a different idea or take on things. So also provided by Google is an iOS testing tool called Earl Grey, which I will dig into in a little bit. There's a kind of new kid on the block called Detox, which is primarily for testing React Native apps using JavaScript, but it has a lot of promise, and so I've included it here on this slide. You may or may not know that Microsoft has its own sort of testing technology via the acquisition of Xamarin, which supported for a long time Calabash as their kind of preferred cloud testing language. And so Microsoft has sort of retooled this as something called Xamarin.UITest. And it still invokes some Calabash stuff under the hood, but it's all a .NET C# API rather than a Ruby Cucumber API, which is what Calabash was all about. This is a cross-platform tool, just like Appium and Detox, so that's one of the things that makes it unique. Finally, Facebook has produced a WebDriver compatible automation engine for iOS called WebDriver Agent. It's actually what powers Appium's iOS support. It's built on top of XUITest, and because it's maintained by Facebook, some people out there use it directly, but you know, it has some advantages and disadvantages. So, but before I kind of go into more detail on these tools, let's just take a look and see, you know, again, what the kind of split is between open source and proprietary, and it is what you would expect. So again, Apple's solution is proprietary, and pretty much what other people use are open source tools. So, and this isn't to say that there aren't other proprietary tools out there made by other companies. However, I don't really hear about many people using them. By and large, the community of testers has decided that writing tests using open source technologies is pretty much the way to go, unless you're stuck with Apple tools. Okay, so let's have some fun and look at a number of dimensions that each of these frameworks have qualities for. So I think it's important to when you're making a choice about which test automation framework to use, to think not about just one factor, but to think about a very holistic set of factors. And so I made this chart to kind of illustrate the entire set of factors you might want to consider when thinking about which of these tools might be best for you or your team. And of course, I can't tell you how to value any of these dimensions over any other dimension. So I'm presenting them here sort of equally, but of course, for your own situation, you might care more about which platforms are supported on a tool or one of these other categories. Like if you know that you don't have access to the source code of an app that you want to test, you are limited to several of these frameworks. You can't just have your pick of any of them. So let's go through this a bit. And I'm aware that this chart is a bit big, so I've broken it out into several other charts that'll be easier to read. And before we begin, I just wanted to say thank you to Matthew Edwards at Instructure, who helped me gather some data and helped me make sure that this chart wasn't wishful thinking or my own lies to you today, but is in fact reasonably true. So let's get started. First of all, let's look at essentially the things you can run with these different frameworks. So in terms of platforms, most of them are a single platform. The only multi-platform tools are Appium, Detox, although I have an asterisk by Android because their Android support is in beta. It's not officially released yet. And of course, Xamarin solution built on Calabash is cross-platform as well. Appium here kind of wins, I think, and which is why I've highlighted the box. I should mention that I've sort of added my own value judgments into these charts by highlighting the background of the boxes where I think have the biggest advantage or the biggest pro for each of these dimensions. So one or more frameworks can win in each of the dimensions. So I think Appium wins in terms of platform support, because not only do you have iOS and Android, you've got Mac OS, you've got Windows desktop apps via WinAppDriver, and the Appium driver architecture is so flexible. It's very easy to create drivers for new platforms, which is part of Appium's vision. In terms of modes, we have, what do I mean by mode? I mean a style of app, I guess. And you can see here what the example modes are. Do you have a native app? Do you have a hybrid app? Do you have a web app? That kind of thing. So again, Appium wins, I think, because it has support for all app modes across iOS and Android. There is good support for hybrid apps in Espresso, But the rest of these technologies are really focused on just native apps, which is fine if that's the thing that you're automating. But it's often the case that you encounter a web view in your automation, or at the same time as automating your native app, you also have a website or a web application or a web version of your app for your company that you need to automate in addition to your native app. And for that, I think Appium also wins because you can end up sharing a lot of code and infrastructural considerations. You don't have to have two completely different code bases to test your native versus your web app. In terms of language support, most of these frameworks are single language or single style of language. For example, with Espresso, you've got to have a JVM language because it all runs by being bundled in with your Android application. Similarly, for iOS, you're writing in Objective-C or Swift if you're using XUITest or Earl Grey. So this is where the WebDriver-based solutions really shine because WebDriver, Selenium for web testing was architected such that you could write tests for web browsers in any language using the client-server architecture that they chose to implement. So there are already existing client bindings in Java, Python, Ruby, C#, JavaScript, Objective-C, Swift, PHP. I think also like Haskell, Perl, Go, pretty much any language has a Selenium client, and most of them have official Appium clients as well. So Appium and WebDriver Agent are both, I think, come out on top here in terms of language support. I have a column here for protocol. Again, this whole column is sort of a value judgment on my part, but I think it's an important one to make because most of these tools have implemented their own API, which means if you start using the tool, you're locked into that tool, or else you have to rewrite all of your tests. There is one exception, however, which is the WebDriver protocol. And this is what Appium and WebDriver Agent have chosen to expose as the automation API. And the WebDriver protocol, as you can tell by its name, is of course focused around web browser automation. So it doesn't have everything that you need for mobile automation, but it does have the advantage of being an official web standard, which means great cross-platform support for browsers, all kinds of involvement from all kinds of people in the industry on making sure that the standard works, and easy extensions for what we're doing with Appium or what WebDriver Agent is doing. So I think it's advantageous to use a protocol that, at least theoretically, doesn't lock you into one tool versus another tool. If you're writing iOS tests, you can run on a WebDriver Agent directly, or you can run on an Appium. And for the most part, you wouldn't have to make very many changes to experiment with those different tool choices. Okay, let's take another set of categories here. One dimension that I think ends up being important for a lot of teams is whether you need to dig into the source code to get your testing done. And this really comes down to team organization, not really technical considerations, but more organizational considerations. So for example, some companies are set up where the development teams develop the app and then they hand over a build of the app to the testers, and the testers are supposed to make sure that it works however they can. Maybe the company doesn't even care whether it's automated or manual testing, and the testers just want it to be automated for their own sanity. So in that case, they don't have the source code, so they're limited to these frameworks that don't require the source code. For example, Appium. On the other hand, you might have a team where the developers and the testers are the same people, and you've got native app developers. So, I'm an Android developer. I don't know anything about iOS or the web. I just write Android code in Java all day long, and I'm also responsible for testing. Well, then it probably is a pretty great experience for me to use Espresso because it's built right into Android Studio. I'm using my favorite language, Java. I have the source code because I'm working in it all day long, and it's just a good experience. So that might be okay for that team. So it really depends on your team here. But in general, I think not having the requirement of the source code being present on your machine or accessible is a benefit. You might also wind up in a situation where you need to test multiple app interactions. So your app depends on some third-party app in order to work correctly. How do you test that if you don't have the source code? So this is where a tool like Appium might be a requirement for you. It's also interesting to think about what the underlying technology is that these different frameworks rely on, because it's not as simple as just saying Appium is Appium and Espresso is Espresso and so on. Part of the complexity is that some of these tools build on other tools. For example, Detox builds on Earl Grey and Espresso, and Appium builds on WebDriver Agent and some of the technologies from Google. There's even an Espresso driver for Appium that's in beta. Microsoft has released an Appium-compatible automation engine called WinAppDriver, which is bundled into Appium. So it's not as simple as just Appium. Several of these tools are produced by the people that make the mobile operating systems. So Espresso is produced by Google. Google makes Android. XUITest is produced by Apple. Apple makes iOS. And I took that to be a benefit here because, at least theoretically, this means that these test frameworks can stay in sync with the mobile operating system more easily than the third-party frameworks, which have to do some work or play some catch-up in order to make sure that they support latest versions of mobile operating systems and so on. So I think it is an advantage to Espresso and XUITest that they are produced by Google and Apple. Although depending on how highly you think of Google and Apple's software quality, maybe this is a disadvantage. And it's also true that a tool like Appium does a lot to cover over some of the flaws of the underlying technologies. When there are bugs in XUITest, for example, both WebDriver Agent and Appium find ways to work around them so that the user of Appium or WebDriver Agent don't have to encounter that flaw. So I could also have spun this to say that being built on top of other underlying technology like Appium is a positive. So again, it really depends on your perspective here. We all, sit and write code all day long. We do that in some development environment, whether that's Vim on the command line, my personal favorite, or whether you're a kind of IntelliJ person or really love Microsoft's IntelliSense or whatever it is, Visual Studio. People are very passionate about their IDEs. So choosing a testing tool that you're going to have a good experience with working all day long in your favorite IDE could be something that's really important to you. So, something like Appium doesn't have any specific IDE integration other than if you're working in a typed language, you have access to the API from within the code or things like that. Whereas there are tighter integrations with some of these other tools in Android Studio and Xcode. So if you love to write code in Android Studio or Xcode all day long, again, it might be a benefit to use Espresso or XUITest. When we're done writing tests, we have to run them. And anymore, it's not typically a good idea to try and handle the running of all of the tests across all the environments on every commit and all of that yourself. You can if you want, but it's a big pain to maintain all of that infrastructure, maintain the devices or simulators or emulators that are important for your use case and so on. That's why it's important to look at which service providers support the framework that you're thinking of choosing. And again, here, I think that the more options you have, the better, because just like you can be locked into a particular test framework, you can also be locked into a particular cloud provider if they're the only one that supports the tool that you're using. And that's not a great situation. For example, the only cloud provider that I know about that supports Earl Grey is BuddyBuild, and they were recently acquired by Apple. So Earl Grey is produced by Google, and Apple and Google are competitors. So will BuddyBuild continue to support Earl Grey? I don't know. Then you might be out of luck. So, it's important to think about how you would be able to switch from one cloud provider to another with your test suite if you had to. It's also important to think about the quality of the cloud provider. In some cases, you might want to look at the cloud provider first, and then once you've found the best one, figure out what technologies they support, because you're going to be spending a lot of time running tests on your cloud provider, and you don't want to be fighting against them. So picking your favorite provider and really doing some due diligence there might help you make a decision about framework. Finally, I think it's interesting to look at how these different tools are developed, because again, once you pick a tool, you've invested a lot of development time into writing your tests using that tool's API, and it's not easy to just go and switch to something else. So you want to be sure that that tool is going to be around for a while. You want to be sure that the authors of the tool are not going to make decisions that are counter to your own interests. And so I've kind of labeled each of these frameworks with how open source they are. Because I think ultimately, from the perspective of the user, if you're relying on a tool that is fully open source, fully transparent in its leadership and governance, with a fully published roadmap and with full ability for you to dive in and help guide the direction of the project, then I think you're in a good spot. You have reasonable confidence that if something starts going wrong with the project, and if you really care about it, you can do something about it. You can't just throw up your hands and wait for Google to do something about it. So that's where I think projects like Appium or Detox that have really good open source hygiene are really advantageous. Some of these other projects, something like Espresso, you can see the source code, but you're not going to go and submit patches that are going to get merged anytime soon. And if you have bugs, you can report them, and who knows the process by which they get fixed. Something like XUITest, you're just completely out of luck. You can't even see whether other people have submitted the same bug before. You're completely at the mercy of Apple's completely opaque process. So I think these are arguments and motivations in favor of throwing your lot in with projects that have chosen to be fully open source and fully open in their processes. Okay, so let's have a little bit of recap and summing up here. And as we do that, I think also looking at kind of how widely adopted these tools are is kind of a final token to consider. Being widely adopted doesn't mean something is great, but it does mean that if you run into a problem, chances are someone else has run into it. And if there's a solution, you're likely to find it on Stack Overflow or an issue tracker or in a webinar like this or something. So I think that Appium is probably today's most popular open source technology. It's hard to quantify this. People don't really share numbers about usage. But Appium among the open source entrants is probably the most popular. And Espresso and XUITest are probably the most popular kind of native frameworks for single platform automation. And all the rest don't have a lot of usage, or they've waned in usage. Some of that is because maybe there's not a lot of cloud vendor support for some of these other technologies, and so people haven't really put them into production as much, so to speak, or maybe the technology is new, like Detox. So either way, you have to kind of factor that in and really make sure that if you're going to be embarking on one of these new projects like Earl Grey or Detox, that you're ready to dive into their code and figure out what's going wrong and maybe help make their code better along the way. So the strongest value and the weakest point of each of these frameworks. I think Appium's has a couple strong values, which is total flexibility in how you work it in to your own pipeline, using any language you want, using any test runner you want, leveraging your existing WebDriver skills. Appium also has great support for a variety of platforms, including mobile, web, and hybrid app modes. Weak points from what I see in the community speed and stability are often brought up as frustrations with Appium. And I have a little asterisk there because I could give a whole talk on what speed and stability actually mean in Appium and how it's probably much more stable than you think, and how it probably could be much faster for you than maybe it currently is with some tweaks. But I want to grant this point that compared to frameworks like using Espresso directly or Earl Grey directly, it is not as fast and doesn't have some of the built-in synchronization features that keep those frameworks very stable. What Appium can do, of course, is build on top of those frameworks and provide a WebDriver interface to them, so it can sort of absorb them rather than have to compete with them. Espresso is officially supported by Google, and it's fast and stable for Android. On the other hand, you can only write Android tests in it, and you can only use Java or Kotlin. Similar story with XUITest, supported by Apple, but only for iOS, and you have to use Objective-C or Swift. Also, it turns out that it's actually not even that fast or reliable. Earl Grey is faster and more reliable from what I understand. However, there is kind of a V2 rewrite in progress, so who knows whether that will make it better or worse, assuming better, otherwise they wouldn't be rewriting it. It's also officially supported by Google, and Google is a big company that everyone has heard of and has good developers, so that's good, right? Detox is really geared towards writing React Native applications. I've been playing around a lot with React Native myself. I think it's fantastic technology. So if that's kind of your thing and you want to stay in the JavaScript world, Detox seems like a great choice, especially if you're willing to kind of go out on a limb and use alpha, beta level software. Can't run Detox on the cloud, as far as I know. And judging by the issue tracker, there's a fair number of bugs there. It's still new, so that's what you expect. But hopefully it will stabilize some more in the future. Xamarin UI Test is officially supported by Microsoft. You've got the App Center integrations. You can write in C# in Visual Studio, if that's your thing. And it is pretty stable. Of course, you can only write it in C#. So if that's not your thing, you won't like it at all. Finally, WebDriver Agent has some of the same benefits of Appium, except it also has the same drawbacks as Appium, and you can only use it for iOS. So there you have it. This is my take on each of these tools and why I think you might be interested in them, why you might not be, and a good way to kind of compare and contrast the different value that they provide. So I'm just going to quickly go back to the whole chart and let you have another look at it. We'll provide the slides after the webinar, so don't feel like you need to memorize this at this point. But as you can see, just by looking at the whole thing, I really still believe that Appium is a great choice for a lot of teams. It's got a lot going for it. You know, how many categories are there? 9. I think it wins or ties in 7 out of the 9 categories. That's a pretty good showing. But again, it really depends on your team, how your team is set up, what your particular needs are. I'm not going to tell you that Appium is the best tool for every situation. I like it. I put a lot of my time into it. But for certain teamwork, certain organizations of teams and certain technical problems, you'd probably be better off using some of these other tools. So there it is. Let's now look at kind of how you would get started with each of these so that you can walk away, if you're interested in one of them, with a little bit of an understanding of how you would write your first test. So I don't have time to actually show code examples and dive into each framework at that level of specificity, but I will share how you would get started. So with Appium, you install Appium via npm. There's also a graphical version of Appium called Appium Desktop, and you're responsible for getting your system set up to be an Android or an iOS developer. So it's not more difficult than getting set up as a developer for Android or a developer for iOS. Then you simply use the WebDriver API in either a Selenium or Appium client in the language of your choice, write some test code, find some elements, click on them, send keystrokes, that kind of thing. Then you can fire up the Appium server. So it's sitting there listening for test requests. Then you run your test using Python or Java or test runner or whatever. The test commands get translated to WebDriver HTTP calls, go to the Appium server, turns them back into automation commands and behaviors for the particular platform that you've requested to automate, and returns WebDriver responses. And then those responses are made available through the client library to your test script, so you can validate that something worked the way you expected. Espresso. So the way that Espresso works is you basically add Espresso to your Android app's test dependencies in Gradle or Maven or whatever. Then you write tests that extend the JUnit test class, and you import the Espresso library. The way that the Espresso library is set up, there are these things called view matchers. They're sort of like element locator strategies, if you're more familiar with the Appium world. They match views. So a view could be a whole screen, or it could be a particular UI element within a screen. And you can then chain actions on the response from the view matcher. So actions are the same kinds of things you'd expect from any of these frameworks, things like click or type text or whatever. One nice thing, I guess, is that the same library contains assertion methods. So you can chain assertions with your actions without having to figure out, Hamcrest or some other assertion library. And then you simply use JUnit, the JUnit variant that comes with Android, and Android handles all the rest. So it's all this very encapsulated experience. XUITest is similar. You don't have to explicitly build anything into your application. You simply run, you simply create test files with XC test case classes in them. So XC test case classes expose a setup method, which you can override, and you basically have access to this object-oriented library with singleton objects like XCUI application. So you can call launch on it, as I say here, and that will launch your application. And from there, you continue to use this API to find elements and interact with them, just as you would in any of the other tools. And there's a built-in assertion library, which has nice integrations into Xcode, so you can see how your assertions fare in this special UI that they built called the test navigator. So that is XUITest. With Earl Grey, you do have to add something to your iOS project. So if you've got an iOS application project, you have to add a unit testing bundle, even though we're not going to be using it for unit testing per se. And then we configure Earl Grey on our system. You can install Earl Grey either through Ruby or adding it as a CocoaPod dependency. CocoaPods is a package manager for iOS applications. So what this does is it makes sure that the Earl Grey library is accessible to your application's test code. So from there, we sort of do the same thing that we would do with XUITest, except we import Earl Grey rather than XUI application or any of these other XUITest classes. Earl Grey is set up very similarly to Espresso, where you've got what are the equivalent of view matchers, and then you use methods chained on them to perform your actions and make assertions all in one go. One nice thing about it is that just like XUITest, it can give you a nice set of results in Xcode's test navigator. So again, it has the benefit of this tight integration with Xcode. Detox, remember Detox is for writing tests for React Native applications in JavaScript. So the way you get it, because you're into JavaScript, if you're writing Detox, is via NPM. So you install it. You also need to install some dependent libraries like Apple SimUtils that it uses under the hood. Then it has a tight integration with how React Native apps are built. So React Native projects have something called a package.json, which is an NPM Node.js thing. You can just add Detox configuration to your package.json, for example, which device you want to run your tests on, how to build your application, if there's any special flags that are required for Xcode build and so on. And then you write a test script in JavaScript. And because Detox is not just a library, because it's also a runner, it injects global variables into your test script, which you can then just use without having to import or anything special. You get device and element global objects with various useful methods on them. And then, as I said, it's also a runner. So first you use Detox build. That suffices for getting Detox built into your application, and then you run it using Detox test. You're not limited to just one test runner. You can use Mocha, you can use something else, but you do have to execute it with Detox test because that's how it as I said, injects the objects which you need for testing. Okay, Xamarin UI test. Basically, if you've got Visual Studio, Xamarin app set up, for example, you need to add a new project to the solution with an appropriate template. So there's a template that you can find. It's built in Visual Studio called UI Test, and that gets all the appropriate dependencies for you using the NuGet package manager. Then you have, so sort of have this concept of multiple projects. You've got your actual mobile mobile app code projects. Then you've got this test project that we've just added, and you have to associate them using the Visual Studio UI. Then, as with many of the other frameworks, you create a test class that extends an appropriate test class, in this case, Xamarin.UITest. And in your setup method, which you override, you configure your app for the particular platform you want to run it on, because Xamarin UI Test is cross-platform for iOS and Android. And that starts the application. This gives you back an app object, which is essentially the C# equivalent of what you could do in Calabash, and you match predicates and then perform actions. So very similar to the design of Espresso or XUITest. Finally, WebDriver Agent. So the story here is similar-ish to Appium in terms of how you write and run your tests. Getting going is a little different. Appium bundles WebDriver Agent and installs it and builds it and runs it for you. So if you're using WebDriver Agent on your own, really what you have to do is clone the repo from GitHub, get dependencies. You'll have to have your system set up with Homebrew and a few other things to make that work correctly. And of course, Xcode. And then you have to open up the WebDriver Agent Xcode project. So in this repo that you've cloned, there's an Xcode proj file. You open that up, you build it and run it. And when that happens, WebDriver Agent will launch as a server, just like Appium launches as a server, only WebDriver Agent as a server is running on the simulator or the device. It's not running on the host machine. So it will spit out in the iOS logs a port that you can use to connect to the server. From that point on, it's just like Appium, more or less. You have your WebDriver style test script, point it towards the port that WebDriver Agent has said it's running on, and off you go with your test. So it's a little more involved than Appium, but if all you need is iOS, this is a decent WebDriver-based solution. Okay, so that was today, and a little bit of a slightly deeper dive into what each of these frameworks might look like if you were to explore them today. I'm going to take the next 5-6 minutes and talk about what I think might happen, what the situation might look like 5 years from now. And I say in my dreams, not because this is necessarily the best situation for me, but because basically I have it as Appium kind of taking over 5 years from now. And that may not be the reality of the situation, but as the Appium project lead, I certainly have to hope and believe that that's possible. So what do I see happening? I see some of these projects going away, just like 5 years ago, we had a completely different set. I think some of these will go away or be consolidated. So given the lack of vendor support for WebDriver Agent, I see most people using it via Appium, not on its own. So if it continues to exists within Appium. Xamarin UI Test, I don't see a lot of usage there. I don't see Microsoft really promoting it or pushing it forward per se. I see them taking the approach of, hey, use whatever tool you want. Use Appium, use Espresso with our suite of solutions. So given the low volume of usage there, I see that probably becoming defunct. XUITest, I really couldn't say what's going to happen to it, but knowing Apple, I'm sure that they'll come out with some other completely incompatible technology sometime in the next 5 years. So I'm guessing that it dies as well, but you never know. Maybe they'll turn over a new leaf. I see Espresso continuing to be very popular, but I'm hoping that with the advent of Appium's own Espresso driver or some other way of making the benefits of Espresso available to Appium users, that most people, for the most part, would find it sufficient to access Espresso within Appium without having to use it directly. Of course, there's always going to be the people that prefer the Android Studio, write the code and write the tests together kind of situation, and I imagine Espresso will continue to thrive in that scenario. Similar story with Earl Grey. I see the benefits that it has, and I'm excited about exploring whether we can pull that into Appium or convince the Earl Grey team to put a WebDriver protocol layer on top of it so that Appium could simply proxy to it. There's some interesting options that we're looking at there. Detox is so new, it's kind of hard to tell what's going to happen with it. Again, since it's right now just a kind of pure JavaScript solution, it could either totally blow up. People could really get into React Native apps more than they already are, and it could become kind of the de facto standard. I could also see it becoming the basis for another set of Appium drivers for iOS and Android. It's JavaScript, Appium's JavaScript, so that would be a pretty easy integration. So it's something that we're also looking into. So it's not just test frameworks that are going to change in the next 5 years. I think mobile apps themselves are going to change, and test frameworks and test practices, and we as testers are going to have to change to accommodate the changes in the applications themselves. So I think apps are going to become more integrated with other applications and our physical locations and the experiences that we're having at any given moment. So apps are going to become more situation aware and situation dependent even. Augmented reality apps are a good example of this, how they are dependent on and integrate with what's going on in the world around you, not just what's going on the screen. I think we're going to see, unfortunately, for us as testers, even more kind of form factors. People are going to keep coming up with hardware to put apps on. There's going to be apps on everything. Places where there should be no apps, there's going to be apps. And, you know, good or bad as an overall situation, we're going to get paid to test it. So, you know, probably good for us. But, you know, we're going to go beyond phone and watch and TV to VR goggles to whatever the next version of Google Glass is going to be, to installation or site-specific hardware, which will run customer generic applications, tables of the kind that Microsoft has been playing around with over the last number of years, and who knows what else. And I think that these will start to solicit applications from third-party developers, from your company, from my company, to run on these various kinds of devices. Maybe they'll all run Android, maybe they'll all run something else, but there'll be a lot of form factors. Finally, I think that, not finally, second to finally, I think that we'll start seeing solutions that attempt to make the problem developing for many platforms easier. So I've been talking a lot about React Native. I think that's a good example of a technology that sees the problem of multiple operating systems and puts together a pretty creative solution of using JavaScript and web technologies to build native feeling, actual native apps for those two platforms. React Native has been ported to a number of other environments as well. So potentially React Native itself could continue to lead the way and allow the writing of single code base applications that then get deployed on a variety of actual platforms with minimal differences. I also think that applications are going to have to reach for more than the stock UI components, more than just the list views and input fields and data grids that we're familiar with in our apps of today. They'll have to do this to stand out just because there's going to be so many apps, and they'll have to do it to solve the problems that that new user interfaces will bring up. Things like augmented reality or virtual reality will require new sorts of interfaces. How do you build UIs for these kinds of things? I'm not a UX expert. I'm sure lots of people are thinking and talking about this. I just know that we're going to have to get beyond the simple form-based applications and move to being able to test these other things. And there's not a good solution for that right now, as we know from game testing. There's not a lot of great tools for automated testing of video games. And I think that apps of the future will have more in common with maybe video games of today than we imagine. So again, not just the apps will be different, but we're going to have to test them in an increasing number and variety of ways. So we're going to have to think about visual testing. This is an Applitools webinar, and we should talk about this push that Applitools is making to get this concept of AVM into our everyday vocabulary as testers. So application visual management, thinking about the visual appearance of your application as important as the functionality of it, because in many ways the line between those things is very blurry. So visual testing, does my app look the way it's supposed to? Very, very important. Visual bugs are huge differentiators in terms of retaining users and things like that. Performance testing, not just does my app work, but does it work fast enough and responsive enough? And when I tap this button, do I get immediate feedback? Am I, spinning CPU cycles waiting for a network request when I should have a more fluid UI? These kinds of things. Security testing, with the proliferation of various kinds of malware and different attacks, and the ubiquity of smartphones are going to be very attractive for people looking to do malicious things. How do we automate the concept of security testing? Location testing. Does my app work the same way anywhere in the world? Does it, especially for apps that are dependent on locations, augmented reality applications, things like that? Whole new classes of bugs are going to arise for these sorts of applications, and we'll have to figure out a way to test them in automated fashion, simulate different locations, simulate real-world environments, things like that. Finally, flow testing, and this is kind of a new thought, but sort of automatically testing how navigable your application is, and quantifying the concept of user goals and difficulty in obtaining the goals, and making sure that the thing you want your users to do is the easiest thing that your application allows them to do, and finding a way to make sure that that stays that way across multiple revisions of your application. So in general, of course, in the future, we're going to see automation as a trend continuing. We're not backing down from automation. It's one of these viruses that just keep spreading because it's fundamentally about making things faster and easier, and that's what businesses are always on the lookout for. So everybody is familiar with the term shift left. That's going to keep happening, of course. Figuring out how to put automated tests and other automated processes as early as possible in development cycle is just part of being good agile developers. We're going to see a lot more kind of automating of the automation. So we have test code, which is automation. Our test code automates our mobile apps. But how is that test code generated? Right now, it's generated by hand. And I think we're going to see a lot of people trying to tackle the problem of how to get the test code in the first place, using code generation from visual IDE-like environments, or using artificial intelligence. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening here. I think we're also going to see just a proliferation of tools that are going to lead to tool and framework fatigue on the part of us as testers. And it's going to be important for us to figure out how to consolidate the industry and really, as a collective, put our weight on the tools that have the most promise to avoid so much fragmentation in the tools and so much churn that we're rewriting our test suites every 6 months or every year just because something better comes out. We have to figure out a way to continue supporting existing tools and making them better and continuing to put effort behind them versus just jumping on a new bandwagon every 6 months. So this is part of what I think Appium has the promise of. It's what its vision is. I think, Appium, as I see it in the future, is simply an extension to the WebDriver protocol, but one that's become official. A set of classes and libraries for easily writing drivers, so that the driver library for Appium can just explode and go beyond iOS and Android and Mac and Windows to anything. And so there's a set of multiple drivers, each one that just provides a simple WebDriver interface on top of whatever the best automation technology of the day is, plus other utilities that make automating that platform more pleasant. In other words, Appium is a stable API that doesn't change on top of an ever-changing set of underlying technologies, because that's what technology does. It keeps changing, keeps getting better, but you can avoid the pain of having to accommodate those changes yourself by helping Appium maintain that stable API on top of those other technologies. And of course, the more people are involved in this, the bigger the knowledge base is, the bigger the community is that can help you when you encounter a problem that someone else has already encountered. So, we can also think about whether the WebDriver protocol is actually, the end of the line, or how will it have to change to accommodate all these new types of applications and testing modes that we've talked about. Can it? Should it? And if the answer to those is yes, how do we make that happen? I have other thoughts here, but I've basically talked about all this new kinds of testing. How is this all going to happen? Let's work together to form or extend a standard for these kinds of testing rather than continuing to implement new APIs all the time. So let's compete on implementations. Let's compete on speed and stability of a test framework, not on the API, not on the standard. Everything should really just be WebDriver. And if WebDriver isn't good enough, well, we should go through a community process of making it good enough so that we can keep using it, because it's in everyone's interest to simply use the same protocol and not compete on the API level. So, of course, we need your support to do this. promote WebDriver over the other options, contribute your wisdom and experience to the community, and help maintain Appium. If you give a little bit, you get a lot more in return. That's the magic of open source. So take some time in your day at your company, convince your boss to have someone support Appium full time, whatever it is. We need your support, but together we can move forward into all these new realms of automated testing and figure it out. Thanks a lot. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you today about all these topics. I went a little longer than I wanted to, so I'm not sure how much time we have for questions, but if Adi thinks there is time, then by all means, fire away.
So first of all, thank you for this amazing presentation. We are a bit over time, but if you have a few moments, let's take just one or two questions. How about that?
Sounds great.
Sounds great. Okay. So first one, can any of the frameworks you mentioned be used for performance testing? And if not, any recommendations?
They can. I'm most familiar with Appium. So actually just a week or two ago released an Appium Pro newsletter on performance testing of Android applications using Appium. So you can test CPU, memory, network performance indicators using Appium, and you can actually get those indicators in your test script, which you can use to make verification. So you could include performance tests as part of your CI pipeline. You could, fail a build if it degraded in performance. I'm sure that you can do that with some of these other tools as well. I'm not as sure how, so I'd recommend looking into Appium for that, but probably you can do it with a number of them.
Next one.
We are ready.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, so last one, sorry, we are out of time. If you decide to use Appium, but then find a new OS-specific feature in Espresso or XUITest, how quickly can a patch in Appium be created to exercise that new functionality?
Great question. The answer is pretty quickly, usually. If there's already an Appium driver for the technology, so let's take XUITest, for example. Apple releases a new library method in XUITest. Whenever that's out in beta, we're pretty quick at enabling that functionality within Appium. So there's been a bunch of stuff that we've discovered you can do using SIM control or things like that were released by Apple, and we very quickly brought that stuff into Appium. So if you're willing to run Appium from source, it could be as fast as days from when a beta is released that we've got some of this new stuff out. Obviously, there's never any guarantee on this, but usually if you can do it in XUITest, we'll find a way to put it into Appium. It's more when you can't do things in XUITest and we're trying to find ways to do them in Appium. That's the challenging part. But when there are operating system blessed features, it's typically very easy to bring those in and accommodate them. So great question. Thank you.
Okay, so unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank everyone that joined us for this live session on your Friday morning or evening, depends where you are. And of course, I want to thank our expert speaker, Jonathan Lips, for this amazing and in-depth presentation. So thank you, Jonathan, for taking the time and doing this webinar with us.
Yeah, it was awesome. Thank you.
Great. So I just want to remind you all that the link to the recording plus Jonathan's slide deck will be emailed to you on Monday. And I hope to see you all at our next event. Have a great weekend.